To understand why medieval people were constantly searching for ways to escape reality, we must first understand the reality they lived in. Medieval life was not romantic, not heroic, and certainly not comfortable. It was harsh, unpredictable, and often terrifying. For most people, existence itself felt like a punishment, one that never paused, never softened, and rarely rewarded hope. From the moment a medieval child was born, survival was uncertain. Infant mortality was extremely high. Many children never lived past their 5th birthday. Disease spread rapidly through open towns and villages, and there was no real understanding of germs, hygiene, or medicine. A simple infection, a small wound, or contaminated food could lead to a slow and painful death. Life expectancy was short, and death was not a distant idea. It was a daily presence. Poverty defined the lives of the majority. Most people were peasants tied to the land, working endlessly for lords who owned everything. They woke before sunrise, labored until their bodies ached, and slept exhausted, only to repeat the same cycle the next day. There were no weekends, no vacations, and no guarantee that hard work would even lead to enough food. Hunger was common. Starvation was always close. Even those who were not poor lived under constant pressure. Nobles faced political betrayal, violent rivalries, and the ever-present threat of war. A single wrong decision could lead to imprisonment, execution, or the destruction of one's entire family. Castles were not just homes, they were fortresses built out of fear. Violence was woven into everyday life. War was frequent and brutal. Medieval battles were not clean or heroic affairs. They were bloody, chaotic, and deeply personal. Soldiers fought face to face, hearing the screams of dying men and feeling the impact of blades against bone. Survivors returned home traumatized, carrying physical injuries and psychological scars that medieval society had no words to describe, let alone treat. Religion dominated every aspect of life, but even faith brought fear rather than comfort. The Church taught that life on earth was a test, filled with suffering by design. Pleasure was often labeled sinful. Pain was considered meaningful. Hell was described in terrifying detail, and many truly believed that a single mistake could doom their soul forever. Instead of easing anxiety, religion often intensified it. Natural disasters added another layer of terror. Floods, droughts, famines, and plagues struck without warning. People had no scientific explanations for these events. When crops failed or disease spread, many believed God was angry, demons active, or witches were at work. Fear of the unknown was overwhelming. The Black Death alone reshaped the medieval mindset forever. Entire towns were wiped out. Families disappeared within weeks. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. People watched neighbors collapse in the streets, coughing blood, covered in boils, knowing they would likely be next. There was no escape from the sight, smell, or sound of death. In such a world, mental escape became a necessity, not a luxury. When reality offered only pain, exhaustion, and fear, the human mind searched for relief wherever it could find it. Medieval people did not have modern entertainment, psychology, or therapy. There were no novels to lose oneself in, no movies, no music streaming, no controlled medications. But the desire to forget, even temporarily, was just as strong as it is today. This is where intoxication enters the story. For medieval people, escaping reality did not always mean chasing pleasure. Often, it meant dulling pain, silencing fear, or simply feeling something different, even if that feeling was confusion, dizziness, or hallucination. Alcohol, herbs, rituals, and strange substances became tools for survival. Not because people were reckless but because they were desperate. Importantly, many medieval people did not even realize they were getting high, in the modern sense. They lacked the vocabulary and scientific understanding to separate intoxication from divine visions, illness, or madness. A hallucination could be interpreted as a message from God. Euphoria might be seen as spiritual blessing. A loss of consciousness could be mistaken for possession or prophecy. Daily life itself pushed people toward altered states of mind. Drinking weak alcohol from morning to night was common because water was unsafe. Herbal remedies were taken constantly for pain, sleep, digestion, anxiety and childbirth. Fasting and intense prayer could induce trance-like states. Smoke from incense, fires and enclosed spaces affected breathing and perception. Even bread could be contaminated with hallucinogenic fungi. Reality, as medieval people experienced it, was already unstable. The boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world felt thin. Visions, voices, and strange sensations were not immediately questioned, they were expected. In such a mindset, escaping reality did not feel rebellious. It felt natural. This chapter is not about judging people through modern eyes. It is about understanding them. When survival is uncertain, when suffering is constant, and when death is always near, the human brain adapts. It searches for relief. It seeks moments of peace, numbness, or meaning, by any means available. Before weed, before whiskey, before modern drugs and psychology, medieval people were already experimenting with ways to step outside their unbearable reality. Some escapes were accidental, others were deliberate. Some brought comfort. Others brought terror. But all of them tell the same story: when life becomes too heavy, humans will always find ways, dangerous or divine, to put it down. Even if only for a moment. And this is where the journey truly begins. In the medieval world, drinking alcohol was not a habit, it was a necessity. Long before scientists discovered bacteria or clean water systems, medieval people learned one harsh truth through experience: water could kill you. Streams, wells, and rivers were often contaminated with human waste, animal remains, and decaying matter. Drinking straight water was a gamble and many lost. Alcohol, however, told a different story. Beer, ale, and mead were boiled during preparation, which killed many harmful organisms. Even when weak, these drinks were far safer than untreated water. As a result, alcohol became a daily staple of medieval life, not just for adults but for children as well. From peasants in muddy villages to monks in stone monasteries, nearly everyone drank some form of fermented beverage every day. But this constant drinking came with consequences. Most medieval alcohol was low in strength compared to modern spirits. Yet its continuous consumption created a near-constant state of mild intoxication. People did not drink to get drunk in the modern sense. Yet many lived their entire lives slightly altered, their minds dulled or relaxed by alcohol from sunrise to sunset. Breakfast might include weak ale. Lunch came with another cup. Dinner brought more. In some regions, workers were even partly in alcohol. It was fuel, medicine, comfort, and escape all at once. For peasants, alcohol softened the brutality of labor. Endless days in the fields destroyed the body. Back spent permanently. Hands cracked and bled. Ale numbed pain. Slowed hunger, and offered brief relief from exhaustion. After long hours of work, drinking was worth a few pleasures available. And one of the few ways to forget how trapped life felt. For nobles, alcohol served a different purpose. Feasts were extravagant displays of power and excess. Wine flowed freely, sometimes mixed with spices, herbs or honey. Intoxication loosened tongues, strengthened alliances, and encouraged indulgence. Political decisions were often made under the influence, with consequences that could shape entire kingdoms. Monasteries, surprisingly, were among the largest producers of alcohol. Monks brewed beer and wine not only for survival but for trade. In many cases, monastic brews were stronger and more refined than those available to common people. While monks were expected to live disciplined lives, alcohol was seen as acceptable. Even holy, when consumed within the rules of the church. Yet even the church recognized the dangers of drunkenness. Religious texts warned against excess, describing intoxication as a gateway to sin. But these warnings rarely stopped people from drinking. When life offered so little comfort, restraint felt unnatural. Over time, alcohol became more than a drink, it became an emotional shield. Fear of war, famine, disease, and divine punishment pressed constantly on medieval minds. Alcohol dulled that fear. It made hunger easier to ignore. It turned despair into laughter, at least for a few hours. Importantly, medieval people did not fully understand intoxication as a chemical process. They described its effects in spiritual and moral terms. A joyful drunk was seen as blessed. An aggressive drunk was thought sinful or possessed. Memory loss, confusion, or emotional swings were often blamed on weak character or spiritual failure, not substance effects. This misunderstanding made alcohol even more dangerous. People had no concept of addiction as a medical condition. Those who drank constantly were not seen as dependent, they were simply living normally. When alcohol became unavailable, withdrawal symptoms such as anxiety, shaking, or hallucinations were terrifying and often interpreted as madness or demonic influence. In crowded cities, public drunkenness was common. Taverns served as social centers, places where people shared stories, rumors and fears. Songs were sung, arguments erupted, and violence was frequent. Many crimes, fights, and accidents occurred under the influence, yet society accepted this as part of life. Women too were deeply affected by alcohol culture. While often judged more harshly for drunkenness, many women relied on alcohol to cope constant pregnancies, childbirth pain, and limited autonomy. Alehouses run by women were common in earlier medieval periods, giving them rare economic power, until laws and social pressure pushed them out. Children growing up in this environment learned early that altered consciousness was normal. Drinking was not hidden or forbidden. It was woven into daily routine. A medieval child might never experience true sobriety in the modern sense. Alcohol also blurred the line between medicine and escape. Doctors prescribed wine for digestion, mood, sleep, and circulation. Herbs were often mixed into alcoholic drinks, increasing their psychoactive effects. A simple cup could relax the body, or push the mind into strange territory. In times of crisis, drinking intensified. During famines, wars, and plagues, people drank more, not less. Alcohol became a way to face death without collapsing under fear. When the Black Death swept through Europe, taverns stayed full even as graves filled faster than they could be dug. Some drank to forget. Others drank because they believed tomorrow might never come. This constant relationship with alcohol shaped medieval psychology. Emotional expression became exaggerated. Violence flared easily. Grief and joy blurred together. In a world already unstable, alcohol amplified everything. And yet, despite the damage it caused, alcohol also held society together. It provided calories, community, and moments of shared humanity. Without it, medieval life may have been even more unbearable. Before weed, before whiskey, before distilled spirits, alcohol was humanity's oldest and most reliable escape. It was legal, accepted and essential. It softened a cruel world while quietly reshaping minds, behaviors, and entire cultures. But alcohol was only the beginning. Because when drink was not enough to silence pain or fear, medieval people turned to other substances, plants, roots, and remedies that promised healing, and sometimes delivered hallucinations instead. In the medieval world, the line between medicine and intoxication was thin, sometimes invisible. Long before laboratories, prescriptions or controlled doses, healing came from the earth itself. Roots, leaves, seeds, and flowers were crushed, boiled, smoked, or swallowed with faith and desperation. These herbs were meant to heal the body, but many of them quietly altered the mind. Medieval people lived in constant physical pain. Infections, broken bones, toothaches, childbirth, and chronic illness were part of everyday life. Doctors were rare, expensive, and often ineffective. For most people, relief came not from trained physicians, but from herbalists, midwives, monks, and village healers. People who relied on generations of traditional knowledge. Some of these remedies truly helped. Others were dangerous. And many did both at the same time. Plants like henbane, belladonna, mandrake, and datura were widely known across medieval Europe. They were prescribed for pain, insomnia, anxiety, and surgical procedures. In small doses, they could calm the body, In slightly larger doses they could completely detach the mind from reality. Henbane, for example, was used to dull pain and induce sleep. But it also caused vivid hallucinations, confusion and memory loss. Patients reported seeing strange creatures, hearing voices, or feeling their bodies float away. Medieval healers did not describe these effects as side effects. They described them as visions, dreams, or spiritual experiences. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was even more powerful. Women sometimes used it cosmetically to dilate their pupils, which was considered attractive. But internally, it caused delirium, euphoria, and terrifying hallucinations. People under its influence could lose all sense of time, identity, and physical control. Mandrake, with its human-shaped root, held a special place in medieval imagination. It was believed to scream when pulled from the earth, killing anyone who heard it. This myth reflected real fear. Mandrake was extremely potent. It was used as a painkiller and anesthetic, but it could easily push users into deep trance states, dreamlike paralysis or complete unconsciousness. These herbs were not rare. They grew in fields, forests and roadsides. Knowledge of their effects spread orally, passed down through generations. Healers understood that dosage mattered, but without precise measurements mistakes were common. 1 cup too strong, 1 root too large, 1 patient too weak. And suddenly healing turned into horror. People would wake screaming from visions of demons. Others wandered naked through villages, completely detached from reality. Some believed they had traveled to heaven or hell. Others thought they were animals, spirits or dead. Many never fully returned to normal. Medieval society had no language for chemical intoxication. When someone experienced hallucinations, there were only a few explanations: divine vision, demonic possession, madness, or witchcraft. Rarely did anyone consider the plant itself as the cause. This misunderstanding shaped everything. A healer who accidentally caused hallucinations might be praised for inducing holy visions, or accused of dark magic. A patient who spoke of flying, glowing beings, or other worlds might be seen as chosen by God, or marked by the devil. Context mattered. And fear mattered most of all. Women were especially vulnerable in this system. Midwives and female healers knew the most about herbal medicine, particularly related to childbirth, pain relief, and fertility. They used plants to ease labor, induce sleep, or reduce suffering. But when something went wrong, blame fell quickly, and violently. A woman who caused strange visions or altered behavior could easily be labeled a witch. Her knowledge, once valued, became evidence against her. In this way, psychoactive herbs quietly fueled paranoia, superstition, and persecution. Herbal intoxication was not always accidental. Some people deliberately sought altered states, whether for spiritual insight, emotional relief, or curiosity. Humans then, as now, wanted to step outside their minds. Drinking herbal teas, inhaling smoke, or consuming special mixtures became intentional escapes from unbearable lives. These experiences were not recreational in the modern sense. They were intense, unpredictable, and often frightening. A single session could last for hours or days. Time distorted. Fear transformed into wonder or terror. For people surrounded by death and despair, even terrifying visions could feel meaningful. Pain relief was one of the strongest motivations. Medieval surgery was brutal. Limbs were amputated without anesthesia. Teeth were pulled with metal tools. Herbs that induced unconsciousness or dissociation were invaluable. Patients might scream less. Surgeons could work faster. Survival increased sometimes. But the psychological cost was high. People emerging from herbal intoxication often described lingering confusion, emotional numbness, or spiritual obsession. Some believed they had glimpsed divine truth. Others were haunted by visions they could not forget. In a deeply religious culture, such experiences reshaped beliefs and behaviors. The Church officially warned against excessive use of powerful herbs, especially those associated with pagan rituals or folk magic. But enforcement was inconsistent. In rural areas, herbal medicine remained essential. When official medicine failed, people returned to the forest. It is important to understand that medieval people did not see themselves as getting high. They saw themselves as surviving, healing, or seeking meaning. The altered states were not side effects, they were part of the experience. In a world where reality was cruel and rigid, the mind's ability to break free even briefly felt like a gift, yet that gift came with danger. Without knowledge of dosage, brain chemistry, or addiction, people walked a fine line between relief and ruin. Some became dependent on herbal mixtures. Others permanently damaged their minds. And some paid with their lives. Still the knowledge survived, passed in whispers, hidden in monasteries, preserved in folk traditions. The medieval world was quietly experimenting with the human brain, long before science caught up. Herbs healed bodies. But they also opened doors in the mind, doors that medieval people did not fully understand, could not control, and often feared. And when fear mixed with altered consciousness, it created something even more powerful than intoxication. It created belief. And belief, in medieval Europe, could change the course of history. In medieval Europe, the Church did not just guide faith, it shaped reality itself. God was not distant or symbolic. He was everywhere. Watching, judging, rewarding, and punishing. Heaven and hell were not abstract ideas, they were destinations believed to be closer than tomorrow. In such a world, altered states of consciousness were rarely questioned. They were interpreted. Visions were not unusual, they were expected. When someone claimed to see angels, demons, saints, or divine light, medieval society did not immediately doubt them. Instead, people asked why the vision had appeared and what it meant. Was it a blessing? A warning? A test? Or a temptation sent by the devil? The Church provided answers, but those answers were deeply influenced by power, fear, and control. One of the most common paths to religious visions was fasting. Medieval Christians fasted frequently, sometimes for days or weeks. Food deprivation alters the brain. It causes weakness, dizziness, emotional swings, and hallucinations. Today science explains this clearly. In the Middle Ages, fasting was seen as purification, stripping away the flesh to let the soul speak. Monks, nuns, and devout believers often pour in long fasts. Bright lights, voices, feelings of floating outside the body. Intense euphoria followed by crushing despair. These experiences were recorded in religious texts as divine encounters, not as biological responses to starvation. Sleep deprivation played a similar role. Monastic life demanded long hours of prayer, often late at night or before dawn. Interrupted sleep weakens the brain's ability to distinguish reality from imagination. In candlelit churches filled with chanting voices and echoing stone walls, the mind became highly suggestible. Incense added another layer. Churches burned large amounts of incense made from resins and herbs. In enclosed spaces, heavy smoke reduced oxygen levels and introduced psychoactive compounds into the air. Breathing slowed, thoughts blurred, time stretched. Worshippers entered altered states without realizing it. When combined, fasting, sleep deprivation, incense, repetitive prayer, emotional intensity, the results could be overwhelming. People wept uncontrollably. Others collapsed. Some spoke in tongues or described visions with stunning detail. These moments felt real because, to the brain experiencing them, they were. The Church interpreted these experiences carefully. If a visionary was obedient, humble, and aligned with Church doctrine, their visions were often accepted as holy. Saints' lives are filled with accounts of ecstasy, states of extreme joy, pain, and transcendence. Some described burning love for God so intense it felt physical. Others experienced paralysis, shaking, or loss of bodily sensation. These states strongly resemble what modern science would describe as neurological or chemical highs. But if the visionary challenged authority, questioned doctrine, or existed outside Church control, the interpretation changed. The same vision could be labeled heresy, delusion, or demonic deception. The experience did not change. Only its political usefulness did. Women were especially vulnerable in this system. Many of the most intense religious visions were reported by women, nuns, mystics, and lay believers. Their fasting was often more extreme. Their emotional devotion was praised yet feared. When a woman claimed divine communication, church authorities walked a thin line, celebrate her as a saint or silence her as a threat. Some women were canonized. Others were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. The difference was rarely the vision itself. It was obedience. Religious ecstasy also became a socially acceptable form of escape. While alcohol and herbs might be condemned as sinful, spiritual intoxication was praised. Feeling overwhelmed by God was considered virtuous. Losing oneself in prayer was holy. The Church offered an altered state that did not challenge its power, one it could regulate and define. But not all divine highs were controlled. Mass religious movements sometimes erupted, fueled by shared psychological and emotional intoxication. Crowds fasted together, prayed together, and experienced visions together. People claimed miracles, prophecies, and divine commands. These moments could destabilize entire regions. The Church feared uncontrolled ecstasy more than sin. During plagues and disasters, religious intoxication intensified. People marched through streets whipping themselves, chanting, crying, and collapsing. These flagellant movements created collective trance states. Pain, exhaustion, and emotional overload pushed participants beyond normal consciousness. Many reported visions of salvation or damnation. Again, the experience was real to them. Pain itself became a path to altered states. Some believers believed suffering brought them closer to God. They embraced self-denial, isolation, and physical torment. The brain, overwhelmed by pain, released chemicals that dulled sensation and produced feelings of peace or detachment. What modern medicine recognizes as endorphin release, medieval believers saw as divine presence. The Church taught that joy on earth was suspicious. Pleasure belonged to heaven. This belief pushed people to seek intensity through suffering rather than comfort. The result was a culture where extreme mental states were normalized, encouraged, and interpreted spiritually. Not everyone trusted these experiences. Some church scholars warned that visions could be deceptive. They argued that the devil could imitate divine light, that the human mind was weak, and that not every vision came from God. But these warnings often came too late, after belief had already taken hold. For the average medieval person, religion offered meaning in chaos. It gave suffering a purpose and visions an explanation. But it also blurred the line between faith and intoxication. People did not choose spiritual escape and chemical escape. They often experienced both, sometimes at the same time, a fasting monk drinking weak oil, inhaling incense, and praying through the night could easily cross into altered consciousness without ever touching what we would call a drug. The Church did not invent religious highs. It organized them. In a world where life was brutal and short, divine intoxication offered something powerful: the feeling that pain mattered, that suffering led somewhere beyond the grave. For many, that belief was the strongest escape of all. But outside church walls, another kind of altered state was spreading. One that frightened the Church deeply. Because some visions did not come from fasting or prayer. They came from potions. And those potions would soon be blamed for flight, transformation, and witchcraft. By the late Middle Ages, the line between medicine, intoxication, and magic had blurred almost beyond recognition. Herbal knowledge passed down through generations could heal, or terrify. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the word of witchcraft. Folk remedies, potions, and flying ointments were believed to hold mystical power, but in reality, many of them contained psychoactive compounds that could drastically alter perception, induce hallucinations, or even immobilize the body. The medieval imagination and fear transformed these substances into something legendary. Stories of witches flying through the night sky, meeting demons, or engaging in ritualistic dances were common across Europe. While these tales often had a supernatural veneer, science reveals a more human explanation: psychoactive herbs, interacting with the brain in unpredictable ways. The ingredients were potent. Belladonna, henbane, mandrake, datura, and nightshade were staples of witchcraft recipes. Taken in precise, small doses, they could relieve pain, induce sleep, or provide euphoria. Taken too liberally, they could produce vivid hallucinations, delirium, or even death. The same plants that healed could haunt, and the same sensations that humans interpreted as supernatural were, in fact, the brain's reaction to chemical intoxication. Flying ointments were particularly notorious. These concoctions were typically a mixture of herbs, fats and oils, sometimes applied to the skin. The psychoactive compounds were absorbed transdermally, bypassing digestion and entering the bloodstream in unpredictable ways. Users reported feeling weightless, floating, or flying through the air. They experienced distorted senses of time, heightened emotions, and vivid visions. To a medieval mind steeped in religious belief and superstition, these sensations were indistinguishable from literal encounters with spirits, demons, or the devil himself. Many of these potions were linked to female healers and midwives. Women often held secret knowledge of herbs, remedies, and rituals, making them the custodians of both healing and fear. In a society that distrusted female autonomy, these powers were double-edged. On one hand, women were revered for their skills in easing pain in childbirth. On the other, when something went wrong, or when someone feared the unknown, those same women could be accused of witchcraft. Accusations of witchcraft were not just superstition. They were a form of social control. Communities were tight-knit, resources scarce, and explanations for misfortune desperately needed. When a cow died unexpectedly, a child fell ill, or a harvest failed, it was easier to blame someone who practiced herbal magic than to confront the cruel randomness of nature. Psychoactive herbs, with their ability to induce strange behavior or visions, became both evidence and instrument of these fears. The Church played a complex role in this dynamic. On one level, it condemned witchcraft, calling it heresy and the work of the devil. On another level, the Church itself relied on a controlled form of altered consciousness to maintain spiritual authority. Religious nisions, fasting-induced ecstasy, and ritual trance were sanctioned. Unsanctioned hallucinations from herbs were forbidden. By defining which altered states were holy and which were evil, the Church reinforced its power while terrifying the population. Some reports of witchcraft were undoubtedly based on genuine misunderstanding. A healer using henbane to ease labor might appear unconscious, mumbling, or disconnected from reality. Villagers witnessing this could interpret it as a supernatural event. The woman herself, experiencing intense delirium or hallucinations, might believe she had entered another realm. In many cases, both sides, the witness and the participant, truly believed in the magic. The process of accusation and trial often amplified the drama. Women, or occasionally men, accused of witchcraft were interrogated, sometimes tortured, and forced to confess to acts that defied reason. Flying, night gatherings, and meetings with demons were all included in confessions. The mind, already influenced by herbal intoxication, fear, and social pressure, filled in the impossible details. Confessions were dramatic, detailed, and terrifying. Perfect fodder for folklore, law, and fear. Despite these dangers, psychoactive potions remained in use, often clandestinely. People continued to seek relief from pain, emotional torment, or existential dread. Herbs offered a private form of escape when the world offered none. The risk of accusation added intensity to the experience. Part fear, part thrill, part liberation. Interestingly, some of these practices had legitimate medicinal roots. Belladonna, for example, was used in small doses to relieve pain, reduce inflammation, or treat infections. Mandrake's anesthetic properties could ease surgical procedures. The problem arose when these substances were misused, misunderstood, or administered inappropriately. The effects could be so intense that the line between healing and hallucination vanished. Cultural beliefs amplified the experience. Folk traditions, superstitions, and religious teachings framed altered consciousness as supernatural. A hallucination caused by datura was interpreted as a visit from a demon. A dream induced by henbane was treated as prophecy. The mind, conditioned to perceive the mystical in everyday life, transformed chemical reactions into stories of witches and flight. Ultimately, witchcraft potions and flying ointments reveal a fascinating truth about medieval life. The human desire to escape was universal, timeless, and often dangerous. People sought relief from suffering, curiosity about the unknown, and glimpses of altered perception. Herbs provided a bridge between the physical and the imagined, the painful and the transcendent. The medieval world may have feared witches, demons, and flying ointments. But in reality, these substances offered something profoundly human: the ability to step outside a harsh, relentless reality, even if only for a fleeting moment. They remind us that escape, in all its forms, has always been a part of the human story. And as the Middle Ages progressed, these herbal experiences, sometimes holy, sometimes feared, set the stage for the next chapter in altered consciousness: the sacred and secret experiments of monasteries, where fermented brews and psychoactive substances intertwined with ritual and spirituality. When we think of monks in the Middle Ages, most images that come to mind are of quiet contemplation, chanting in candlelit abbeys, and lives devoted entirely to prayer. Yet behind the serene walls of monasteries, a lesser-known truth emerges: monks were also innovators, experimenters, and masters of substances that could alter the mind. While they devoted themselves to God, they also understood the power of fermented brews, herbs, and sacred rituals to expand consciousness and navigate the hardships of medieval life. Monasteries were, in many ways, self-contained worlds. They grew their own food, tended their own gardens, then brewed their own alcohol. Ale and wine were central to monastic life, not only for sustenance but also for medicine, ritual, and occasional indulgence. Water was often unsafe to drink, especially in winter or in crowded abbeys. Alcohol provided both hydration and safety, boiling away dangerous microbes in the brewing process. But brewing was far more than a practical necessity. Monks experimented. They mixed herbs, spices, and occasionally psychoactive plants into their drinks, creating complex flavors and subtle effects on the body and mind. Some of these mixtures were intended to ease pain or improve digestion. Others were used in ritual contexts, helping monks achieve heightened states of focus, meditation, or trance. Even beyond alcohol, monasteries were home to the careful study of plants and fungi. Monks cultivated medicinal herbs, observing how different species affected the human body. Certain mushrooms were consumed with caution, their effects unpredictable. Some caused mild euphoria. Others produced vivid dreams, and a few could induce powerful hallucinations. In a society without modern science, these experiences were recorded meticulously, often couched in spiritual or symbolic language. A mushroom that inspired visions might be described as revealing the guide, or opening the mind to God. Monastic rituals amplified these experiences. Long periods of fasting, candlelit prayer, and chanting created physical and psychological conditions ripe for altered consciousness. Sleep deprivation, repetitive motion, and sensory focus could combine with the effects of fermented brews, or herbal remedies, producing profound states of awareness. Monks described these moments as closer communion with God, a temporary transcendence of mortal suffering, and an intimate glimpse into spiritual truths. Sacred rituals also included symbolic consumption. Wine was not merely alcohol, it was the blood of Christ in Eucharistic ceremonies. Bread was not merely flour, it was the body of Christ. Ingesting these substances within strict ritual contexts created intense psychological responses. The brain, interpreting sensory input through the lens of deep religious belief, could experience euphoria, or even trance-like detachment. The boundary between spiritual experience and altered mental state blurred, leaving participants convinced that they had touched the divine. This environment created a unique form of escapism. Monks were subject to many of the same stresses as other humans: hunger, illness, fear of death, and the psychological weight of isolation. Yet their lives were also highly structured, leaving little room for distraction or indulgence. By combining ritual, meditation, and selective consumption of psychoactive substances, they created a sanctioned pathway out of ordinary reality, a way to survive, reflect, and even enjoy moments of transcendence. Some monastic practices also influenced the wider population. Pilgrims visiting monasteries often received herbal remedies or medicinal brews, experiencing mild effects themselves. Laypeople interpreted these experiences through religious frameworks: visions of angels, revelations, or spiritual healings. Once again, altered states of mind were woven seamlessly into everyday life, whether through intentional ritual or medicinal practice. It's important to note that these experiments were not reckless. Monks were trained observers. They understood dosage, preparation, and timing, often through decades of experience and careful record keeping. Mistakes were rare but could be catastrophic. Certain herbs and fungi, when misused, caused delirium, paralysis, or death. Despite the dangers, monasteries remained centers of botanical and chemical knowledge, often the only places where such knowledge was systematically preserved. The intertwining of mind, body, and spirit in monastic life also reflects a broader medieval worldview, the belief that reality itself could be manipulated through discipline, substances, and belief. While today we separate medicine, recreation, and spirituality, medieval monks treated these as overlapping spheres. Consuming a carefully prepared herbal infusion, while chanting in a silent chapel, could be simultaneously medicinal, recreational, and spiritual. A holistic approach to the human condition. The broader society sometimes feared these practices, especially when results appeared inexplicable. A monk describing visions after consuming a special brew might be revered or suspected of heresy, depending on context. The Church itself had to balance sanctioning spiritual experience, while controlling interpretations of supernatural phenomena. Too much unpredictability risked social disorder, too little risked stagnation. Monastic experimentation, therefore, existed in a delicate equilibrium between devotion and curiosity, science and superstition. Finally, the monastic use of substances also set the stage for later developments in pharmacology, chemistry, and recreational drug use. By observing plants and fermentation over centuries, monasteries preserved knowledge that would eventually inform modern medicine and alcohol production. They demonstrated that the human desire to alter perception was not merely indulgent but often pragmatic, aimed at survival, insight, and the pursuit of meaning in a harsh and uncertain world. Monks, mushrooms, and sacred rituals remind us that in the Middle Ages, altered consciousness was not always sinful, criminal, or recreational. It was deeply embedded in the spiritual, social, and medicinal fabric of life. They show how humans, constrained by poverty, illness, and mortality, used ingenuity, ritual, and nature itself to find temporary freedom from suffering. And yet, outside monastic walls, not all experiments with the mind were disciplined, observed, or sanctioned. While monks explored substances with caution and purpose, the wider populace sometimes encountered plants and fungi blindly, mixing hope with desperation, and inadvertently stepping into hallucination, danger, or even criminal accusation. The journey from sacred ritual to forbidden intoxication had begun, setting the stage for the next chapter: painkillers before modern medicine, where humans sought relief from suffering in even riskier ways. In a world without anesthesia, antibiotics, or modern surgical tools, pain was an inescapable part of life. From childbirth to battlefield injuries, from broken bones to dental agony, the human body endured suffering in ways that seem unimaginable today. Yet even in these harsh circumstances, medieval people sought relief, and sometimes they discovered substances so potent, they would later inspire modern medicine. Pain was ubiquitous. For peasants it was chronic. Years of labor bent backs, cracked joints and blistered hands. For soldiers it was acute and violent. Battles left men with shattered limbs, punctured organs, and gaping wounds. The simplest medical procedures, amputations, trepanation, or tooth extractions, were executed without modern knowledge of hygiene or anesthesia. Death, infection, and excruciating pain were constant companions. To endure, humans turned to what nature and folklore could provide. Opium was among the most potent and relieving substances. Derived from poppies, it was consumed in various forms: dried resin, extracts and poppy milk. Even small doses provided relief from physical agony. Larger doses induced dreamlike euphoria, calming not just the body but the mind. Opium was considered both medicine and escape, a way to endure suffering without surrendering entirely to despair. Other herbal remedies were used similarly. Henbane, mandrake, and nightshade, which had already earned reputations as psychoactive herbs, were administered to numb pain. They could induce trance-like states where the body no longer felt agony, even as consciousness lingered in distorted perception. Such remedies required knowledge, precision, and careful observation. Miscalculation could be deadly, but for desperate patients, the risk was worth the possibility of relief. Alcohol, already a staple in medieval life, also served as a primitive anesthetic. Surgeons often gave patients strong ale or wine before amputations or other painful procedures. The alcohol dulled sensation, reduced fear, and sometimes induced partial unconsciousness. Combined with herbal mixtures, these rudimentary painkillers offered the only feasible way to survive surgery. Painkillers were not only used for medical purposes, they were also tools of psychological escape. A mother in labor might consume opium or herbal concoctions to ease childbirth, while a soldier might take a mixture to forget battlefield horrors. In a society where suffering was constant and life fragile, pain relief was as much about survival of the mind as of the body. Interestingly, many medieval texts treat painkillers with reverence and caution. Recipes for opium-based remedies or mandrake poultices were meticulously recorded in monastic and medical manuscripts. These instructions often included precise doses, preparation methods, and ritualistic precautions, acknowledging that the substances were powerful and potentially dangerous. In the hands of a skilled healer, they could save lives. In the hands of the ignorant, they could end them. The use of these substances also contributed to the blurring of lines between medicine, intoxication, and spirituality. A patient under the influence of opium might drift between consciousness and dream, experiencing vivid visions, altered perceptions, or deep emotional release. The experience could be interpreted as divine revelation, demonic influence, or simply the mysterious workings of powerful herbs. People did not differentiate between chemical and spiritual highs the way we do today. Women played a critical role in this history. Midwives and female healers often administered pain-relieving herbs during childbirth. In an era when hospital births did not exist and surgical assistance was limited, their expertise could mean the difference between life and death. They combined practical knowledge with generational wisdom, using substances to reduce suffering while also navigating cultural beliefs and social dangers. A misstep could lead to suspicion, accusation, or worse, especially in a society quick to associate mysterious herbs with witchcraft. Painkillers were also crucial in the battlefield context. Injured soldiers were treated in monasteries, taverns, or improvised field hospitals. Opium and alcohol were administered to reduce immediate suffering. Soldiers might later recount intense dreams, hallucinations, or altered states during recovery, memories indistinguishable from divine encounters, nightmares, or the fog of war. Again, intoxication served both physical and psychological survival. Despite their importance, these substances were not universally trusted. The Church occasionally condemned certain herbs as diabolical. Local authorities sometimes restricted access to opium or potent mixtures. Knowledge had to be earned and controlled. Healers who understood these substances wielded real power, and faced real danger. They were simultaneously revered for their skill and feared for their potential to harm. One of the most striking aspects of medieval pain management is its duality. Substances that relieved suffering also carried the potential to induce visions, hallucinations, and altered mental states. Painkillers were not merely medicinal. They were portals to escape, to altered consciousness, and occasionally, to misunderstanding. A patient sedated by opium might experience vivid dreams that were interpreted as divine signs. Pain itself, once dulled, could allow the mind to wander into realms that were mystical, surreal, or terrifying. These early methods of pain relief foreshadowed modern pharmacology. They demonstrate that even in the absence of scientific understanding, humans instinctively explored chemistry, dosage, and preparation to improve survival and quality of life. They also highlight the universal human need to control suffering, not just physically, but psychologically. Ultimately, medieval painkillers tell a story of resilience and ingenuity. They reveal a society that, while often brutal and unforgiving, found ways to mediate agony through observation, experimentation, and courage. They show that even in the darkest times, humans sought not only to survive, but to ease the mind and body, to reclaim a fragment of in a world defined by uncertainty. And as medieval society evolved, the pursuit of relief, whether through herbs, alcohol, or primitive opiates, continued to expand into more structured practices, intertwining with law, religion, and culture. This foundation would influence not only medicine, but the broader human relationship with altered states of consciousness. The next chapter explores one of the most unpredictable sources of altered perception, accidental highs from contaminated food, a phenomenon that combines science, fear, and catastrophe in ways medieval people could neither fully understand nor control. In the Middle Ages, hunger was as constant as the rising sun, and food was a precious commodity. But the food people relied upon was often unpredictable, poorly stored, and sometimes deadly, not just in the obvious sense of spoilage, but in ways that could warp the mind. Long before scientists understood microbiology, toxins and fungi lurking in bread grains and produce caused strange and terrifying effects. These were accidental highs, unplanned trips into altered consciousness that blurred reality in ways medieval people could scarcely comprehend. One of the most infamous culprits was ergot, a fungus that infested rye and other grains. When ingested, ergot produced a powerful chemical cocktail containing alkaloids closely related to modern LSD. Effects ranged from numbness and muscle spasms to intense hallucinations and convulsions. The mind became disoriented, reality fractured. People reported visions of fire, insects, and devils, sensations of flight, or even feelings of being consumed from within. Entire villages could be affected simultaneously, leading to panic, hysteria, and death. This terrifying phenomenon was known as St. Anthony's fire, named after the patron saint of those afflicted. People believed that the flames they felt on their skin were spiritual punishments, divine wrath, or demonic torment. They could not fathom that a simple fungus in bread could create such vivid hallucinations. Religious interpretation, fear, and superstition became intertwined with physiological reality. Other foods carried risks as well. Poorly stored cheese, fermented fruits, and spoiled meats often contained bacteria or molds that altered mood, perception, or behavior. In an era without refrigeration, preservation techniques were inconsistent. Salt, smoke, or boiling offered some protection, but nothing guaranteed safety. Consumption of contaminated food resulted in nausea, delirium, confusion, and fainting. Effects that were unpredictable and frightening. Accidental highs were not limited to adults. Children, the elderly, and the infirm were particularly vulnerable. Their smaller bodies and weaker constitutions made them more susceptible to toxins. A single meal could leave a child hallucinating, a laborer unable to work, or a group of villagers believing they were under divine or demonic assault. The societal impact of these incidents was profound. Communities witnessing bizarre behavior often attributed it to moral failure, witchcraft, or divine punishment. Those affected were ostracized, imprisoned, or executed in extreme cases. Clergy might intervene with prayers, blessings, or exorcisms, further reinforcing the perception of spiritual causation. The same chemical reaction in the brain, viewed through a lens of superstition, became a story of morality, sin, or cosmic justice. Ergot outbreaks were particularly terrifying because they were widespread and unpredictable. A single contaminated harvest could affect dozens, or hundreds, of people across a region. Victims might writhe on the ground, screaming in pain or ecstasy, while neighbors fled in terror, unsure whether to help or pray. Sometimes, people recovered fully; other times, they succumbed to convulsions, gangrene, or secondary infections. Survival seemed random, and understanding was non-existent. Despite the danger, accidental highs were sometimes interpreted positively. Certain hallucinations were believed to offer divine insight, visions of the future, or communication with spirits. A vivid dream induced by ergot might inspire prayers, artistic depictions, or altered behavior perceived as holy. In a culture where signs and omens were taken seriously, the accidental effects of contaminated food could elevate someone to saintly or prophetic status, even if the phenomenon was entirely biological. The phenomenon illustrates a broader pattern in medieval life: humans seeking meaning in chaos. When suffering, disease, or unexpected experiences struck, people instinctively turned to religious, mystical, or moral frameworks to interpret their world. The accidental highs caused by bad food were not merely physical. They were psychological and cultural events, woven into the fabric of medieval understanding. Food scarcity also intensified the effects. Famine left people malnourished, weakening their bodies and minds. Even small amounts of toxins could have outsized impact. When coupled with stress, fear, and religious belief, the result was a perfect storm: physiological intoxication interpreted as divine or demonic experience. Communities could descend into mass hysteria, as seen in historical ergot epidemics that fueled witch hunts and panic across Europe. Accidental highs were, in a sense, unplanned journeys into altered reality. Unlike alcohol or herbs, they were not chosen, measured, or ritualized. They were imposed by circumstance, harvest, storage, environment, and yet their effects were profound. Victims might feel detached from the body, hear voices, see impossible visions, or experience intense emotions. The mind, deprived of rational explanation, filled in the gaps with mythology, religion, and fear. Interestingly, these experiences often reinforced existing beliefs rather than undermined them. People already predisposed to fear witchcraft, demons, or divine punishment found confirmation in hallucinations caused by food. Entire communities could interpret a natural phenomenon as moral proof, sparking long-term cultural consequences, including trials, accusations, and public executions. The story of accidental highs highlights the precariousness of medieval life. It underscores how intertwined survival, belief, and altered perception were. A loaf of bread or a bag of rye was more than food; it could be a vehicle for terror, insight, or both. People learned to navigate these invisible dangers through caution, prayer, and reliance on social guidance, but understanding was always limited, and fear never fully dissipated. Ultimately, accidental intoxication from food reflects the larger medieval struggle: humanity's desire to survive, to make sense of suffering, and to step outside reality, whether intentionally or not. When life offered little comfort, even a contaminated meal could transport the mind elsewhere, sometimes terrifyingly, sometimes illuminatingly. And as medieval society evolved, these unintended experiences would intersect with deliberate human exploration of consciousness. The next chapter explores how different social classes, nobles and peasants alike, developed distinct methods of escape, highlighting the inequalities, ingenuity, and desperation that shaped medieval escapism. In the medieval world, the quest to escape reality was universal, but the methods, means, and consequences were profoundly shaped by social status. Nobles and peasants alike sought relief from suffering, fear, and monotony. Yet the tools available to each class differed dramatically. Understanding these contrasts illuminates not only the psychology of escapism, but also the stark inequalities of medieval life. For peasants, life was relentless. Days were defined by labor from dawn to dusk. Fields demanded attention, animals required care, and subsistence farming offered little reward beyond bare survival. Poverty meant that comfort, leisure, or luxury were mostly inaccessible. Hunger, illness and exhaustion were constant companions. Escaping the harshness of daily life required ingenuity, or substances that were cheap and accessible. Alcohol was a primary avenue. Weak ale, consumed in small doses throughout the day, dulled physical pain, softened the psychological burden of work, and offered brief reprieve from hunger. Herbs such as henbane or mandrake, when available, could provide deeper escape, producing altered perception or dreamlike states. Even prayer and local festivals offered moments of distraction, though these were often fleeting and communal rather than private. Peasant escapes were pragmatic and survival-driven. Intoxication and altered consciousness were not sought for pleasure alone, they were tools to endure reality. A day spent in the fields, soaked by rain or scorched by sun, could be mitigated by a small amount of ale or a calming herbal infusion. The experiences were modest, but for people with limited agency, every temporary reprieve was invaluable. By contrast, nobles had access to a far broader palette of escapism. Wealth, power, and social privilege provided resources to indulge, experiment, and manipulate reality with sophistication. Feasts were extravagant displays of consumption. Tables overflowing with meat, spiced wine, and rare delicacies. These meals were not simply about nutrition, they were sensory experiences, social theater, and, implicitly, a form of intoxication. Wine, particularly imported varieties from France, Italy, or Spain, was stronger and more refined than the weak ale of peasantry. Nobles could combine it with spices, honey, or herbal infusions, creating effects that were both potent and pleasurable. Unlike peasant drinking, which often occurred in a workaday context, noble consumption could be ritualized, private and extravagant. Euphoria, warmth, and altered perception were intertwined with status, ceremony, and identity. Beyond alcohol, nobles experimented with other forms of escapism. Exotic spices, aphrodisiacs, and rare herbs, sometimes toxic, were consumed to heighten sensation or evoke mystical effects. Gardens, forests, and hunting grounds became private stages for distraction and sensory indulgence. Nobles could orchestrate experiences that were immersive, extended, and psychologically complex, unlike the limited brief and practical escapes available to peasants. Social power also allowed nobles to explore more extreme states without fear of punishment. A peasant caught intoxicated or misusing herbs risked ostracism, physical punishment, or accusations of witchcraft. A noble might stumble into delirium, hallucinations, or dangerous excess and remain protected by privilege, wealth, or political influence. The consequences of indulgence were highly unequal. Yet, despite these differences, the underlying motivations were similar. Both peasants and nobles sought temporary relief from fear, anxiety, and the relentless pressures of medieval life. For peasants, escape was survival. For nobles, escape was psychological relief, social performance, or even existential curiosity. Both were deeply human responses to a world dominated by disease, mortality, and unpredictability. Festivals illustrate the intersection of class and escapism. Carnival days, holy festivals, and village fairs often involved communal drinking, music, dancing, and celebration. For peasants, these were rare opportunities to step outside daily toil. For nobles, these events could be performative, showcasing power, wealth, and sophistication. Yet the emotional outcomes, laughter, disorientation, joy or temporary release were remarkably similar across classes. Interestingly, class differences also influenced the perception and social framing of escapism. Peasant intoxication was often seen as dangerous, sinful or morally suspect. Nobility, by contrast, could frame indulgence as refinement, spiritual devotion, or aesthetic sensibility. A nobleman inebriated at a feast might be praised for passion or charisma. A peasant drunk in the same town square might be punished. Society judged not only the act but also the actor. Herbal and psychoactive substances also reflected these disparities. While peasants relied on local plants and simple recipes, nobles could afford imported ingredients, rare spices and potent concoctions. They could experiment with combinations unavailable to lower classes, sometimes producing experiences that were richer, longer, lasting, or more psychologically intense. Access, knowledge, and resources created an entirely different world of escape. However, extreme privilege also brought new vulnerabilities. Excess could lead to poisoning, addiction, or psychological collapse. The very tools that offer liberation could become chains. Nobles might indulge repeatedly, chasing altered states with little self-restraint, unaware of the long-term consequences. Privilege allowed experimentation, but it did not remove human susceptibility to the effects of mind-altering substances. Despite these differences, the common thread remains: medieval humans, regardless of class, constantly sought ways to step outside their daily reality. The methods, sophistication, and risks varied, but the impulse was universal. Alcohol, herbs, prayer, ritual, and festival provided temporary relief, moments of joy, and, in some cases, glimpses of altered perception that blurred the boundaries between life, death, and imagination. The contrast between noble and peasant escapes underscores the profound inequalities of medieval society. It highlights how environment, wealth, and social status shape access to tools, knowledge, and freedom, even in the domain of consciousness itself. But it also emphasizes a fundamental truth. No matter the circumstances, humans have always sought refuge from the weight of existence, whether in simple awe, rare wine, or sacred ritual. Ultimately, the medieval pursuit of escapism was both a mirror and a balm. It reflected the harshness of life while offering temporary solace. And it laid the foundation for future exploration of mind, body, and consciousness, through medicine, ritual, and substances. The stage was set for the next chapter, where feasts, festivals, and collective indulgence would transform escapism into both spectacle and social ritual. In the medieval world, life was structured, harsh, and often brutal, but there were moments when society collectively stepped out of the grind, and the boundaries between reality and intoxication blurred entirely. Festivals and feasts were these rare opportunities. For a few hours, or days, peasants and nobles alike could indulge, escape, and experience a form of controlled chaos. These gatherings were about more than food or drink. They were social theater, spiritual release, and a shared human necessity for emotional escape. Festivals were deeply rooted in the medieval calendar. Religious holidays, seasonal celebrations, and local fairs provided structured breaks from the monotony of daily life. Even the poorest villages could anticipate these days with excitement and preparation. For peasants, these events were often the only time to experience indulgence, revelry, or even mild intoxication. Wine and fermented fruit were consumed in abundance, transforming ordinary people into participants in a shared euphoric spectacle. Feasts, particularly in noble households, offered a different kind of experience. Lavish banquets featured multiple courses of meat, bread, pies, and delicacies like spiced wine, candied fruit, and imported sweets. These were not merely meals, they were performances, displays of wealth and power, and orchestrated sensory indulgences. Nobles could drink wine mixed with exotic herbs, creating subtle psychoactive effects. Music, dance, and storytelling enhanced the atmosphere, guiding participants into a collective, immersive state of altered perception. Drunkenness was an accepted, even expected part of these gatherings. For peasants, Drinking meant a temporary reprieve from labor and hardship. The sensations of warmth, lightheadedness, and laughter softened the harshness of life. For nobles, it could be a strategic indulgence, loosening tongues during negotiations, enhancing charisma, or fostering alliances. Yet for everyone, intoxication carried risk. Spilled drinks, arguments, fights, or even accidents were common. In many ways these gatherings were microcosms of society itself, exuberant, chaotic, and unpredictable. Alcohol was not the only source of altered consciousness during festivals. Herbs, spices, and fermented foods could produce subtle or intense effects. In some regions, psychoactive plants were mixed into wines or breads during celebrations, either deliberately to enhance experience or incidentally due to ignorance of their potency. The result was often spectacular, vivid hallucinations, euphoric moods, and altered perceptions of space and time. Participants might feel as though they were floating, dancing with spirits, or momentarily stepping out of reality. Music, dance, and ritual amplified these effects. A medieval brain is highly responsive to repetitive sound, rhythmic motion, and emotional intensity, especially when combined with substances like alcohol or herbs. Drumming, singing, and chanting could synchronize hearts and minds, creating a collective trance-like state. At the same time, physical exhaustion from dancing and feasting enhanced intoxication, making experiences feel more profound or mystical. For participants, these moments blurred the line between natural and supernatural, secular and sacred, mundane and transcendent. Crowd dynamics also played a role. Festivals were communal experiences, and humans are inherently influenced by social context. Laughter, singing, and even panic could spread through the crowd like wildfire. Individual intoxication was amplified by collective behavior. One person stumbling might spark a domino effect. One loud song might ignite shared euphoria. The result was a communal altered state, where personal and collective consciousness merged into a single, chaotic rhythm. Despite the revelry, danger was never far away. Overindulgence led to fights, injuries, and sometimes death. Poisoning from poorly stored food or herbal additives could occur. Social hierarchies were temporarily suspended, but tensions remained. Nobles and peasants could clash, and old grievances sometimes erupted under the influence of alcohol. Celebrations were moments of temporary liberation, but liberation always came with risk. Religious context added another layer of complexity. Festivals often coincided with holy days, creating an interplay between sacred observance and indulgent escape. Clergy sometimes encouraged celebration, framing it as communal joy or moral reinforcement. At other times, excesses were condemned, punishable, or morally suspect. This tension reflects the medieval worldview. Pleasure, indulgence, and altered states were acceptable only when framed within social or spiritual boundaries. Psychologically, festivals and feasts provided a crucial function. They offered catharsis, temporary freedom from responsibility, and shared emotional release. In a world dominated by labor, disease, and death, such moments of emotional and sensory intensity were vital. They reminded participants that life, though harsh, also contained possibility, joy, and human connection. They also normalized intoxication as a communal, socially sanctioned experience, at least temporarily. Interestingly, festivals often created memories as vivid as dreams. Accounts of medieval fairs describe scenes that modern readers might consider chaotic, surreal, or even hallucinatory. People danced, sang, and fought. They consumed alcohol and herbs, experienced vivid visions, and interacted with an unpredictable social environment. For many, the sensory overload, combined with intoxication, produced experiences that bordered on the mystical, moments where the world felt larger, brighter, and temporarily magical. In essence, festivals and feasts were structured chaos. They allowed people to explore altered states safely within social norms. Peasants, limited in resources and opportunity, experienced raw, unstructured intoxication. Nobles, with access to wealth, herbs, and ritualized indulgence, could orchestrate controlled, multi-sensory journeys. Both, however, were bound by the underlying human need to step outside reality, to relieve anxiety, and to experience life beyond mere survival. These gatherings also reinforced social cohesion, shared intoxication, communal rituals, and collective joy strengthened bonds between participants, providing a sense of identity and belonging. They allowed societies to endure hardship by creating intervals of pleasure and escape. The lessons of these medieval festivals are clear: altered states, whether through drink, herbs, ritual, or sheer exuberance, serve as survival mechanisms as much as indulgence. As the night ended, participants returned to the realities of medieval life: work, disease, hunger, and hierarchy. Yet the memory of intoxication lingered, providing psychological resilience. These moments of escape, however chaotic, were vital coping strategies, illustrating the universality of humanity's desire to step outside itself. The next chapter explores a darker side of medieval escape: gambling, opium, and dangerous indulgences that were not socially sanctioned, highlighting how the search for altered consciousness sometimes crossed into perilous territory. While festivals and communal feasts offered socially sanctioned escape, medieval life also contained avenues of indulgence that were far riskier, often solitary, secretive, and sometimes illegal. Gambling, opium use, and other dangerous indulgences provided intense pleasure, psychological relief, and altered consciousness. But they carried consequences that could devastate individuals and families alike. These experiences highlight the darker, more perilous side of medieval human escapism. Gambling was both a pastime and a vice in the Middle Ages. Dice, cards, and other games of chance were widely played, often for small sums of money, food, or drink. The stakes were sometimes higher, with fortunes and livelihoods at risk. Gambling offered a psychological thrill, a temporary escape from the monotony of daily labor, and an adrenaline-fueled sense of control in an otherwise unpredictable world. The uncertainty of chance mirrored life itself; both could reward or punish, often arbitrarily. Peasants found gambling appealing, because it allowed them to dream of sudden improvement. A few coins won could mean extra food, temporary comfort, or even a fleeting sense of empowerment. Nobles, by contrast, engaged in more elaborate games, wagering not just wealth but prestige, influence, and reputation. In both cases, the act of gambling created a mental state of heightened anticipation, tension, and excitement, a natural form of intoxication even without alcohol or drugs. Alcohol often accompanied gambling, intensifying the altered state. Drinking before or during lowered inhibitions, heightened emotional responses, and created a sense of courage and bravado. For many, the combination of dice, drink, and social interaction created a temporary liberation from the strictures of daily life. But as in all medieval escapism, the line between pleasure and danger was thin. A losing streak could lead to despair, debt, or violence. A winning streak could inspire greed and obsession. Opium, already known as a potent painkiller, was also used for its intoxicating properties. Consumed in teas, extracts, or tinctures, it induced deep euphoria, dreamlike states, and temporary detachment from reality. Some sought opium for relief from physical pain, illness, or emotional distress; others pursued it purely for the pleasure of altered consciousness. In a world where suffering was omnipresent, opium offered a way to forget mortality, hardship, and fear, even if only temporarily. Unlike alcohol, opium was not socially sanctioned for recreational use. Its consumption was often secretive, limited to those with access, knowledge, and means. The risks were significant. Addiction could develop quickly, mental faculties could deteriorate, and accidental overdose could be fatal. Those caught misusing opium faced social stigma, moral condemnation, and even legal consequences in certain regions. Yet the lure of escape was powerful, and some were willing to risk everything for moments of bliss. Other dangerous indulgences included concentrated herbal mixtures, hallucinogenic mushrooms, and experimental concoctions used by folk healers or alchemists. These substances could produce profound altered states, but with unpredictable consequences. Users might hallucinate, become immobilized, experience intense euphoria or terror, or suffer permanent damage. The medieval understanding of dosage, toxicity, and individual physiology was limited, making every experience a gamble, sometimes deadly. The psychological draw of these indulgences was universal. They allowed humans to confront the harsh realities of medieval life indirectly. Hunger, disease, social inequality, and the ever-present threat of violence created mental strain, anxiety, and despair. Risky indulgences offered a temporary reprieve, an artificial paradise where suffering was muted and perception was transformed. They were intensely pleasurable precisely because life was otherwise so harsh. The social context also shaped the consequences of indulgence. Nobles might indulge in secret without fear of legal repercussion, their wealth insulating them from social consequences. Peasants and lower-class individuals faced harsher penalties. Being caught with opium, hallucinogenic herbs, or gambling debts could result in public shaming, corporal punishment, or imprisonment. The same behavior produced radically different outcomes depending on social status, a recurring theme in medieval escapism. These dangerous indulgences also blurred boundaries between recreation, ritual, and crime. A herbal concoction could be medicinal, intoxicating, or evidence of witchcraft. A gambling game could be entertainment, social commentary, or a moral failure. Opium use could alleviate suffering, provide pleasure, or signify moral weakness. The medieval mind struggled to categorize these experiences, creating a culture in which altered consciousness was at once desired, feared, and morally ambiguous. Despite the risks, these indulgences persisted across classes. The human desire to escape through chemical, sensory, or psychological means was relentless. Medieval people were willing to experiment, to test limits, and to embrace danger for the fleeting rewards of altered perception. In a world without structured mental health, recreational options, or modern medicine, risky indulgences were a natural, even necessary, coping mechanism. What emerges is a pattern. Medieval escapism was not only about pleasure but also about survival, adaptation, and psychological resilience. Drinking, gambling, opium use, and other indulgences provided a buffer against the relentless pressures of daily life. They transformed monotony into excitement, pain into euphoria, and fear into thrill, though sometimes at great cost. Ultimately, these practices underscore a timeless truth: the human need to step outside reality is universal. Medieval people, constrained by social hierarchy, poverty, and disease, explored altered consciousness in ways that were innovative, dangerous, and deeply revealing of the human condition. They remind us that the pursuit of escape, pleasure, and mental reprieve is not modern, it is fundamental. The next chapter examines another dimension of medieval human escapism: the use of art, poetry, and literature to enter other worlds, showing how imagination became a tool for transcendence when substances and social indulgences were unavailable. While alcohol, herbs, opium, and risky indulgences offered physical or chemical paths out of reality, medieval people also discovered that the mind itself could serve as a portal. Art, poetry, and literature provided a safe, socially sanctioned way to experience altered perception and step beyond the harshness of daily life. In a world defined by labor, disease, and strict hierarchies, creativity became a crucial vehicle for escape. Illuminated manuscripts were among the most striking examples of this phenomenon. Monks, scribes, and artisans meticulously painted intricate designs on religious texts, weaving gold leaf, vivid pigments, and symbolic imagery into pages of devotion. The process of creating, or even simply observing, these works could transport the mind. Patterns, colors, and iconography induced focused attention, almost meditative in nature, drawing viewers into sacred narratives. A simple story of a saint could become a visual journey, a mental voyage through heaven realms and moral lessons. Poetry similarly offered escape. Medieval verse often explored themes of love, chivalry, adventure, and divine contemplation. Troubadours sang of distant lands, heroic deeds, and courtly romance, while written poems recounted tales of enchantment and allegory. For listeners and readers alike, these narratives provided an immersive experience, allowing imagination to wander freely. A commoner listening to a traveling minstrel could temporarily leave the monotony of the village and envision castles, knights, and heroic quests. For the nobility, poetic courts offered structured, intellectual enjoyment with subtle psychological stimulation. Stories of the supernatural were particularly potent. Ghosts, demons, angels, and magical creatures populated folklore and literature alike. These tales were not merely entertainment, they functioned as vehicles for altered perception. Listening to or reading about impossible events encouraged mental visualization, emotional engagement, and imaginative risk-taking. In effect, the brain simulated the experience, creating psychological and emotional shifts similar to those induced by mild intoxication. The psychology of immersion was critical. Humans are capable of mental transport through narrative, particularly when combined with emotional stakes, or sensory description. Medieval art and literature exploited this naturally. Visual imagery, repetition in poetry, and dramatic storytelling heightened focus and engagement. Readers or listeners could feel transported, as if entering the story themselves. Imagination became a form of escape that was safe, socially acceptable, and endlessly creative. Religious literature offered both moral instruction and intense emotional experience. Mystical texts described visions of heaven, the afterlife, or divine interaction. These writings guided the mind toward experiences of awe, terror, or ecstasy, altered states comparable to those induced by fasting, prayer, or psychoactive substances. For monks, nuns, and devout laypeople, meditating on these works provided a structured pathway into transcendence. A controlled method of experiencing altered consciousness while maintaining social and spiritual propriety. Artistic expression itself could also be transformative for creators. A scribe illuminating a manuscript, or a painter painting a cathedral wall engaged in repetitive, detailed work for hours at a time. The combination of focus, rhythm, and creativity produced states akin to trance. Pain, fatigue, and worldly concerns faded, replaced by absorption and mental elevation. For artisans, this process was simultaneously labor, devotion, and escape, a unique intersection of the physical, spiritual, and psychological. Literature also served as social escapism. Tales of knights, forbidden love, and distant lands allowed entire communities to experience wonder collectively. Storytelling occurred in marketplaces, courts, and homes, engaging both young and old. This form of entertainment united audiences, creating shared moments of delight, suspense, and imaginative journeying. These communal experiences provided emotional release, strengthened social bonds, and reinforced cultural norms while simultaneously transporting participants beyond immediate reality. Interestingly, creative escapism was often safer than chemical or physical methods. While alcohol, opium, or herbal intoxication carried physical risk, literature and art offered psychological elevation without bodily danger. For those with access, whether through education, wealth, or religious affiliation, imagination became a potent tool for survival, joy, and transcendence. The only limitation was the mind itself. The impact of medieval creative works extends to modern understanding of escapism. Today, psychologists recognize that immersive storytelling, visual art, and music can alter perception, affect emotion, and reduce stress. Medieval humans intuitively harnessed this principle, creating experiences that enriched the mind, soothed suffering, and offered pleasure, even when material or social resources were scarce. Art, poetry, and literature also democratized escapism in ways chemical substances could not. While only some individuals had access to opium, rare herbs, or private feasts, storytelling and art reached broader audiences. A traveling bard, a village festival, or a church tableau could expose dozens or hundreds of people to collective imaginative experiences. In this sense, Creative media functioned as the accessible high of the Middle Ages, a shared journey into the mind that transcended social boundaries. Ultimately, these practices illustrate the ingenuity of medieval human survival. When life imposed relentless stress, disease, and hardship, people found ways to step outside reality using nothing more than perception, imagination, and culture. Creativity became both a balm and a tool, a method of experiencing joy, transcendence, and altered consciousness without physical risk. These escapes reinforced social cohesion, encouraged emotional resilience, and nurtured the mind in a world otherwise dominated by necessity and suffering. The next chapter explores forbidden pleasures and illicit substances, tracing how medieval fascination with intoxication and mind alteration intersected with morality, law, and clandestine culture, setting the stage for modern perceptions of risk and reward. Medieval society was a paradoxical landscape, one in which desire, indulgence, and curiosity thrived even as moral codes, religious dogma, and legal structures sought to suppress them. Forbidden pleasures and illicit substances, ranging from potent herbs to clandestine brews, offered humans pathways out of the rigid boundaries of reality. But these indulgences were fraught with danger, social risk, and moral tension, revealing much about the interplay between human impulse and societal control. The church and secular authorities maintained strict oversight over consumption and behavior. Alcohol, when consumed excessively or outside sanctioned contexts, was condemned as sin. Herbs that induced hallucinations could be interpreted as witchcraft or heresy. Gambling and sexual indulgence were moral crimes in many regions. Rules were enforced inconsistently, often influenced by class, local custom, or the discretion of authorities. Yet human desire frequently outpaced regulation, giving rise to a clandestine culture of indulgence. Psychoactive herbs were central to this hidden world. Belladonna, mandrake, henbane and datura, already familiar from witchcraft and medicinal use, found their way into secretive experiments. Users sought sensations ranging from mild euphoria to vivid hallucinations. In the hands of folk healers or daring nobles, these substances could temporarily dissolve reality, producing altered perceptions of time, space, and self. Yet their potency made miscalculation, deadly convulsions, delirium, or death were real risks, often making these experiences simultaneously intoxicating and terrifying. Illicit alcohol also played a role. Monks may have brewed potent wines, but clandestine taverns and distillers created spirits outside legal or religious control. These drinks were sometimes adulterated with herbs or chemicals to intensify effects. The result was a potent mix of intoxication and unpredictability. For the consumer, the experience was thrilling, a temporary escape from the constraints of work, poverty, or social hierarchy, but it carried social and physical danger. Getting caught with such forbidden drinks could result in fines, public shaming, or even corporal punishment. Gambling intersected with these forbidden pleasures. High-stakes games occurred in secret, away from public scrutiny and legal oversight. Dice, cards, and other forms of chance provided both excitement and opportunity. But the risk of loss was severe. Entire households could be ruined, debts incurred, or reputations tarnished. Gambling became a vehicle for psychological escape, a momentary illusion of control over an otherwise uncertain life. When combined with alcohol or psychoactive herbs, the experience could approach ecstasy, or chaos. The use of forbidden substances was often tied to secrecy, ritual, and social networks. Knowledge of potent herbs or exotic brews was passed down orally, closely guarded within families, guilds, or religious orders. Misuse or exposure could lead to accusations of sorcery or moral corruption. As a result, indulgence was not only a physical experience but a psychological one, the thrill of secrecy, the risk of punishment, and the tension between desire and morality heightened perception, making experiences more intense. Sexuality was another domain of forbidden pleasure. Medieval moral codes strictly regulated sexual behavior, particularly outside marriage. Yet illicit encounters often accompanied by alcohol, gambling, or psychoactive substances, offered profound psychological release. These experiences, like others, blended risk, pleasure, and altered consciousness, creating moments in which societal constraints were temporarily suspended. Fear of punishment paradoxically amplified excitement, turning social repression into psychological fuel. The psychological mechanisms of forbidden pleasures are striking. Humans respond not only to the sensory or chemical effects of substances, but also to the social and emotional context of indulgence. Risk, secrecy, and transgression amplify perception and emotional intensity. A sip of strong wine in secret feels more exhilarating than the same beverage consumed openly. A hallucinogenic herb taken illicitly produces heightened alertness and intensity due to fear, anticipation, and novelty. In this way, medieval indulgences were self-reinforcing, merging chemistry, cognition, and social psychology. These indulgences also reflect the social and moral hierarchies of the time. Nobles could often experiment with relative impunity, their wealth, influence, and connections insulating them from legal or social consequences. Peasants and lower classes bore far greater risk. Getting caught could mean corporal punishment, imprisonment, or public disgrace. Yet, across classes, the impulse to explore forbidden pleasures was universal. The desire to escape reality, whether driven by curiosity, suffering, or sheer boredom, transcended wealth and status. Cultural narratives also shaped perception. Stories of witches, demonic possession, and divine punishment both reflected and amplified fear of forbidden substances. Yet paradoxically, these same narratives heightened their allure. The knowledge that a plant could produce visions, or that a clandestine drink could create euphoria, made the experience simultaneous and dangerous and irresistibly attractive. Desire and dread intertwined, creating powerful psychological feedback loops. Ultimately, forbidden pleasures in the Middle Ages were about more than pleasure. They were survival, expression, and human curiosity. When life was harsh, dangerous, and uncertain, clandestine indulgences offered moments of agency, liberation, and transcendence. They were deeply human responses to an unforgiving world, illustrating how desire, risk, and creativity coalesced into experiences that were both exhilarating and perilous. The next chapter explores mental and emotional escapism through meditation, prayer, and contemplation, showing how humans sought altered states without substances or physical indulgence, yet with equally profound effects. While alcohol, herbs, gambling, and forbidden indulgences offered tangible means of escape, the Middle Ages also reveal a subtler, internal form of transcendence: meditation, prayer, and emotional escapism. In a world dominated by hardship, illness, and social hierarchy, the human mind itself became a sanctuary, a space where suffering could be softened, reality reinterpreted, and consciousness temporarily elevated. Monastic life provides the clearest illustration of this phenomenon. Monks and nuns spent hours each day in ritualized prayer, chanting, and meditation. At first glance, these practices seem purely devotional. Yet their effects extended beyond the spiritual. They induced altered states of consciousness remarkably similar to those achieved through or psychoactive substances. Repetition of prayers, the rhythm of chants, and the focus on breath and movement created trance-like absorption, allowing perception of time, space, and bodily sensation. One powerful method was the repetitive prayer or mantra, often recited hundreds or thousands of times daily. The rhythmic cadence of words combined with synchronized breathing produced physiological changes, lowered heart rate, altered brainwave patterns, and a sense of detachment from immediate reality. The mind, focused entirely on the sacred phrase, could enter a state of calm euphoria, heightened emotional sensitivity, or transcendental clarity. In essence, the brain became its own portal to altered perception. Fasting and physical austerity amplified these effects. Hunger, dehydration, and exhaustion were not merely punishments or displays of piety, they intensified the mental experience. Deprived of sensory input or physical comfort, the mind compensated by becoming hyper-aware of internal states. Thoughts, emotions and imagination became vivid, sometimes leading to visions, epiphanies, or intense feelings of divine presence. In these moments, monks described experiences that were simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, mystical and deeply personal. Lay people also practiced forms of emotional escapism through prayer, meditation, and contemplation, pilgrimages, extended devotional rituals, and private prayer provided psychological relief from the relentless hardships of daily life. A peasant kneeling in a quiet chapel could, through focused devotion, experience a sense of control, hope, and transcendence otherwise unavailable in the material world. Emotional intensity, hope, fear, awe, transformed mundane experience into something extraordinary, an internal high. Without substance or chemical aid. The psychological mechanism behind these experiences is strikingly modern. Contemporary neuroscience shows that meditation, repetitive chanting, and rhythmic prayer stimulate brain regions associated with focus, reward, and emotion regulation. The medieval mind, though lacking scientific vocabulary, intuitively harnessed these principles. Rituals, repetition, and contemplation were methods of training consciousness to enter states of elevated awareness, emotional resilience and mental clarity. Music and chant played a complementary role. Gregorian chants, for example, are structured to promote both emotional and cognitive immersion. The slow, melodic flow engages auditory pathways, coordinates brain rhythms, and fosters a sense of spatial and temporal expansiveness. For both performers and listeners, this could produce emotional release, introspection, and a form of transcendent escapism. The same principles applied to local devotional songs, community rituals, and even rhythmic manual labor infused with chant or song. Emotional escapism also included guided visualization, a technique sometimes described in mystical texts. Practitioners were instructed to imagine journeys to heaven, visions of angels, or allegorical representations of virtue and vice. Through vivid imagination they temporarily detached from the physical world, navigating inner landscapes that provided comfort, insight, or exhilaration. These experiences could last minutes or hours, leaving participants with renewed resilience and altered perception of reality. The universality of this approach is striking. Unlike opium, alcohol, or rare herbs, emotional and mental escapism was accessible to nearly everyone, regardless of social class or wealth. It required attention, practice and dedication, but no material resources beyond the mind itself. A poor farmer, a traveling pilgrim, or a cloistered monk could all achieve a form of liberation, demonstrating that the human desire to escape is not bound to luxury or chemical intervention. Interestingly, the risks were primarily psychological rather than physical. Intense meditation or prayer could provoke overwhelming emotions, existential fear, or vivid visions, occasionally frightening the practitioner. However, unlike risky substances, these practices did not carry direct threats of poisoning, overdose, or social reprisal. The mind itself became both instrument and sanctuary, a space where suffering could be transformed into insight, awe, or emotional relief. In some meditation, prayer, and emotional escapism reflect the ingenuity of medieval humans in navigating harsh realities. They demonstrate that altered states of consciousness were not solely the domain of substances or indulgent feasts. The mind could achieve similar elevations, transporting individuals beyond pain, fear, and monotony. In doing so, these practices laid the foundation for a universal truth: humans, across time and culture, seek methods to transcend immediate reality, using both external and internal tools. The next chapter concludes the journey through medieval escapism, by examining the long-term consequences of these pursuits, both physical and cultural, and how these early experiments with mind and body shaped modern understanding of pleasure, risk, and human resilience. Medieval escapism was more than a historical curiosity, it was a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the relentless desire to transcend reality. Across centuries, Humans in Europe experimented with substances, rituals, art, and imagination to soften suffering, heighten pleasure, and explore altered states of consciousness. The legacy of these practices extends far beyond their historical moment, influencing medicine, psychology, culture, and the ways humans continue to seek refuge from the hardships of life. The most immediate legacy is pharmacological. Henbane, mandrake, and other herbs used in the Middle Ages laid the foundation for modern medicine. Morphine, codeine, and other painkillers. Of descendants of these early substances, refined and standardized for safety and efficacy, while medieval users were guided by trial observation, and sometimes superstition. Their discoveries represent the first systematic human attempt to manipulate perception, relieve suffering, and explore consciousness through natural compounds. In this sense, medieval escapism contributed directly to the development of pharmacology and pain management. Equally significant is the cultural and psychological impact. Festivals, feasts, gambling, and art were more than temporary diversions. They reinforced social cohesion, created shared experiences, and allowed emotional regulation in societies facing constant stress. By providing structured or communal outlets for pleasure, creativity, and altered consciousness, these practices functioned as early coping mechanisms, allowing humans to endure hardship without total psychological collapse. The social dimension of escapism, whether through a village festival or a noble banquet, demonstrates that altered experience is not only personal but collective. Art, poetry, and literature were particularly enduring. Illuminated manuscripts, epic tales, and lyrical poetry were designed to immerse the mind, evoke emotion, and transport consciousness. These forms of escapism required no material resources, making them accessible across social strata. They created the intellectual and emotional foundations for later storytelling traditions, theatrical performance, and visual arts. By engaging imagination, they offered a safe form of altered perception, one that could inspire comfort, or delight, on after the individual finished the experience. Meditation, prayer, and emotional escapism contributed to a mental framework that continues to resonate today. Techniques of repetitive focus, visualization, and rhythmic engagement anticipated modern practices such as mindfulness, guided imagery, and meditative contemplation. Medieval practitioners, whether in monasteries, cloisters, or humble homes, were harnessing the human capacity for internal transcendence, revealing that altered states of consciousness are as much a product of cognition and culture as chemistry or intoxication. Yet, the darker aspects of medieval escapism also left a mark. Gambling, illicit substances, and risky indulgences illustrate the dangers inherent in unregulated pursuit of pleasure. Social inequality shaped access and consequences, highlighting ethical and legal challenges that remain relevant in modern contexts of addiction, substance control, and social justice. The tension between desire and restriction, indulgence and morality, remains a fundamental human dilemma, reflected in contemporary debates about drugs, gaming, and entertainment. Perhaps most profoundly, medieval escapism reflects the universality of the human impulse to seek transcendence. Across classes, genders, and regions, people experimented with every available tool, alcohol, herbs, food, art, ritual, and imagination to soften suffering, expand consciousness, or simply experience joy. The specific methods varied, but the underlying drive was identical: a desire to step outside reality, to experience something greater, brighter, or freer than the harsh world demanded. This legacy is not merely historical, it is foundational to modern human culture. Our festivals, celebrations, literature, music, and even recreational substances are direct descendants of these practices. Modern drugs, pharmacology, and therapy are sophisticated extensions of medieval exploration of consciousness. Mental resilience practices, mindfulness techniques, and storytelling traditions carry forward the same psychological functions: coping, pleasure, social bonding, and transcendence. The lessons of medieval escapism also underscore adaptability. Humans respond creatively to constraints, whether physical, social, or cultural. When faced with harsh realities, disease, hunger, labor, inequality, medieval people developed diverse, ingenious methods of psychological and sensory relief. Their resourcefulness reminds us that human survival is not merely biological but cognitive and cultural. Escapism, far from being frivolous, is a central mechanism for enduring and thriving in an unpredictable world. Medieval escapism also illustrates the interplay between risk and reward. Indulgences carried real danger, physical harm from substances, social consequences from illicit behavior, or spiritual anxiety from transgression. Yet humans persisted, driven by curiosity, desire, and necessity. This balance between risk and reward continues to shape human behavior today, from extreme sports to entertainment, social media, and the controlled use of psychoactive substances. In retrospect, medieval escapism offers a profound window into human nature. It demonstrates our capacity to endure suffering, invent solutions, and seek pleasure, even under constraints that modern society can scarcely imagine. It also reveals that altered consciousness, emotional release, and imaginative exploration are fundamental aspects of being human. Across centuries, these impulses have remained constant, even as the tools and technologies have evolved. Ultimately, the story of medieval escapism is a story of human resilience and creativity. From opium dens and herbal concoctions to monasteries, festivals, and illuminated manuscripts, humans in the Middle Ages experimented with every available means to transcend reality. Their successes and failures, joys and horrors, laid the foundation for modern medicine, art, culture, and psychological understanding. In learning how medieval people escaped reality, we learn not only about the past, but about the timeless drive to explore, endure, and elevate the human experience itself. The legacy is clear: escapism is not an indulgence, it is survival, exploration, and the essence of human creativity. Medieval methods may seem strange or dangerous today, but they reveal universal truths about our needs, desires, and capacity to find freedom in any circumstance. In every feast, every prayer, every hallucinogenic experiment, and every story told in candlelight, medieval people demonstrated the same instinct that drives us now: the relentless, unyielding human desire to step outside the ordinary and glimpse something extraordinary.